Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of the Freedom of Conversation podcast. If you missed us last week, we were talking about mass communication. I was talking with a friend of mine, Sarah. If you haven't seen it, feel free to go back and take a look at that. This week, I will be talking with my friend Randy about alcohol, just a little bit about the history, the distribution, and how it's made and everything like that. So with all that being said, let's get started. Hey, Randy.
What's up, Tyler?
Nothing much. How about you, bud?
Nothing, not bad.
Anything new in the life or times of you?
Dude, don't even get me started. That's not what we're here to talk about, though.
Right. So, we're talking about alcohol today. Something that both you and I are partakers in, very much enjoy.
Yes, enthusiasts.
Yeah, and even between the two of us, we've made a batch or two of beer together.
Yeah.
Where do you have any idea where you want to start? What you or what your goal is with the conversation? What you want to talk about?
Well, I think it's. I think when you talk about alcohol, you don't really think about kind of just how much it's impacted our history, both and as kind of like this the cradle of at the cradle of civilization.
Oh yeah.
And even how it ties into America's history. Wars have been fought over it.
Sure.
It's been, the subject of amendments in the Constitution, and it's a huge industry. It's one of those industries that even in times of like recession and depression, it's typically doesn't necessarily as a whole go down.
Right.
It more stays up because people like to drink when they're depressed.
Oh yeah, for sure. Just recently with everything going on, there were statistics about alcohol sales and stuff going on. One thing that when you brought up this topic for us to talk about, you and I have obviously went and done like tastings and stuff, and like been to different breweries, and it's something that both you and I really enjoy. But I never really looked into anything really about it other than the fact that I enjoyed it.
Right.
So I was really excited when you told me that this is what you wanted to talk about, because basically I know about these episodes roughly 2 weeks to 3 weeks in advance, or sometimes even a week, and I just go on a deep dive just so I kind of don't look like a fool at the same time as the people that want to talk to it. And like there's so much stuff. Even just how it created empires and shit.
Yeah.
And like how stuff even functions around what it did and its like cultural significance, no matter where you go. There's not a single place on earth that hasn't been like touched by the culture of alcohol.
Yeah. Well, one of the cool things, one of the things that always really interested me about it is, when you really start to get into something, you want to know everything about how it's made,
right? Kind
of the history of it, and it's alcohol, whether it be beer, wine, or spirits, it's science, it's art. People thought that this stuff was a gift from God. It was magic.
Yeah.
And it's still, the process is just incredible that we as a society, and even as our history, we were able to develop something like this.
Yeah. Yeah, I know when I first started to look into, I didn't really look much into the process of how it's made, more so of just its history and stuff like that, which I know you know a decent amount about how it's made, so I'm looking forward to hearing about that.
Yeah.
I just thought it was funny, like, most people connect it to a genetic, like, abnormality in our genetics when we developed from, like, apes and stuff like that, right? So, like, when food was scarce, like our ancestors and stuff would eat fermented fruit.
Right.
And at first our bodies couldn't handle it. So like a certain percentage of the species and stuff would die off, which is why some animals, like you've seen tragic news reports of like a dog or a cat or something getting into alcohol and they just can't handle it.
Right. So
like it's a weird genetic alteration that let our species as we developed and stuff like that be able to handle it in the first place.
That's kind of the basis of evolution anyway, right?
And depending on what you believe, I'm not trying to ostracize people, I'm not trying to be that guy, like, whatever you believe is what you believe. This is just what I looked up. But I thought that was fascinating. It's not even something like, when you think of alcohol, you think of something that's created.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think of eating a gross fruit and then getting blitzed.
And even now, you can still look at nature, and there are species of, like you say, there's species of apes that eat fermented fruit to get drunk. You've seen the videos online of the squirrel that ate the rotten fruit and got so drunk it can't run up the tree.
Like me every weekend. It's just it's awful. It's embarrassing, really. But no, like you see a lot of videos of like squirrels and stuff that have eaten.
Right.
It's so funny every single time. But yeah, you go from there, and it was weird. Another thing that I kind of noticed is that no matter what point in history you go to, before there was like communication across the world, no matter where you went, there was a type of alcohol that was discovered and developed in a location.
Yeah.
You know?
So I kind of getting ready for this. I kind of looked up a few, just some interesting tidbits. So I think the very first recorded, or the first known location of somewhere that made alcohol, I think it was like it's either 13,000 years ago or it was 13,000 BC. Yeah. It was a brewery in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And so, that's beer. We want to talk about the first wine ever made. We're talking, I think, 7,000 BC, what's now China.
I got you.
And then if we're talking about distillates and spirits, the first big instance of that is distillation in the Alexandrian Empire and the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I thought was really cool is when you get back into that time, it's funny, any alcohol bottle that you look at, especially when it comes to like vodkas and whiskeys, it's always like 3 times distilled, 4 times distilled, 500 million times distilled, right? That wasn't even a thing until, I don't want to say modern history, but modern in the context of the time span that we're talking about.
Right.
Where back in the day, they would just let it ferment and then just drink it.
Right.
So, like, I think that's what led to the popular, or like the explosion in popularity of stuff like mead and stuff like that. Because that was the first time that things like honey and seasonings and stuff kind of got brought into it.
Yeah, well, I had mentioned earlier on, right, that people thought that alcohol was a gift from the gods. I mean...
Right, because you would just leave fruit out.
Right.
You'd mush it up, and then there was no scientific explanation behind it.
I think the Vikings had, like, their magic paddle, which they would bring in all the honey that they had recovered from their raids, and they would mix the big pot with this thing, and then a couple months later, lo and behold, you have mead.
So, what made the paddle magic?
Well, it was
this
so So what this is interesting, right? So the paddle, right, had wild yeast in the wood.
Okay.
So the wild yeast was getting into this honey, water, sugar mixture, and that's what's actually creating that alcohol, right?
Gotcha.
So fermentation happens naturally in nature.
Right.
We've just as a civilization have cultured that yeast and made it a more controlled process.
I got you. That's pretty cool. So basically, the fact that they probably never cleaned that thing probably helped.
There's a brewery out in Portland, Oregon. No, Bend, Oregon, called Rogue Brewing, and they have a beer called the Beard Beer.
Okay.
And it's literally they took swabs of the head brewer's beard. They cultured it out and they made a beer with that beer.
Wow.
Or with that yeast.
Okay, so like I'm an experiment guy. Like I'll do a lot of crazy shit for like a fun story, but that's disgusting. Like what was it? There was another one that was like cat. It was like some kind of weird exotic cat poop beer. You heard about that, right?
I have heard about this one.
There's some cat, and just because, and I'm sure there's some snob out there that's gonna like listen to this someday and be like, actually, it's really good. But like, it's something to do with like it's a coffee stout or something like that, because there's a coffee that's made that a cat or some kind of like, giant cat eats these plants for their digestive system.
Okay, maybe I have heard about this.
And then
okay.
It eats the beans, and then it shits those coffee beans out, and then some idiot was like, I'm going to eat it and drink it. And then they pick the coffee beans out, and then they make it into a coffee and a beer, and then people just drink it up because just like Starbucks, they're going to pay $10 for something that they don't need. Like,
I mean,
baffling.
Where there's profit to be made, right?
Yes. Oh man, I couldn't. Like, for example, people are like grossed out by the thought of eating bugs when there's like certain cultures that like eat crickets and like
right.
There's bugs that are in candy and stuff like that.
Right.
I would eat 10 million bugs before somebody hands me a coffee and is like, "This is made with cat shit." Like, oh, thanks, man.
Yeah.
Man, good thing I pissed in your coffee. Like, this is, I just don't understand it.
I don't know, man.
Sound good at all.
But yeah. But yeah, I mean, back on talking about alcohol. So I mean, like, what do you? I mean, we could talk some of the history. We could talk.
I love the history.
Yeah,
I know some of the most fascinating things that I saw was, I like beer and like whiskey and bourbon. Those are like my two go-to. So that was kind of where I kind of focused in.
Yeah,
there was definitely a lot of cool stuff with wine that I looked up as well.
Yeah,
but Egypt.
Oh yeah,
was one of the very first like mass producers of beer, and it got to the point where they considered it like, I can't remember. I might be mixing my facts with Rome and wine, and Egypt and beer. I actually do think it's Rome and wine, but like everybody had beer. It wasn't something that was like, oh, only the royal people had this. To where even common workers and stuff, it would be in like their ration packs and stuff, or like their food portions for the day is a little bit of beer.
You're right on both.
Oh,
so
cool. I don't hear that often. So that's
so the Egyptian workers had a daily ration of beer, and the Romans had rations of wine. I don't know if it goes back this far. I'm sure it does, because people tend to do things for a long time until innovation comes up. But a lot of times in ancient civilizations and medieval cultures, drinking alcohol was actually safer than drinking water.
Yeah, because of the contaminants in the
water,
right?
Right. Yeah. So you're talking about cholera, you're talking about typhoid.
Yeah. And let it be clear, we're not talking about like they drank 25% whiskey.
No.
This was like less than 1%.
Yeah. It was really, really low. But really it was more of the process that you had to go through to actually make it alcohol.
Yeah, it was essentially the LaCroix.
Yeah.
Of alcohol.
I mean, it didn't taste good. You know, I don't know about Egyptian beer, but there's still some stuff you hear about them finding like alcohol bottles. I think there was one where it was just honey that they found from Egypt.
Yeah.
That dated back 10,000 years or something like that. But yeah, it wasn't high alcohol, but the thing is that you boil the water. Yeast typically tends to do more to the sugars in the beer than your really nasty microbes. And so kind of all of these things together made beer safer. And in fact, I mean, if you look at distillers and scientists in medieval times, right? When they were distilling alcohol, they called it like the water of life, aqua vitae. In Gaelic, they called it Oisca Bretha. And the whole idea was like this was like the essence of life in like liquid form.
Oh man, can you imagine alcohol commercials trying to pull this shit off nowadays? Be like, you're killing people. It would just be really bad.
And that's another interesting thing. We can talk about that down the road, right? Just kind of like how perception of alcohol has changed throughout the years.
Yeah.
But, we're still talking about kind of that medieval time.
For sure. Oh, it also really depends on, like, what was grown. Cause, like,
oh, yeah.
Although I looked up that Egypt primarily focused on, like, beer and stuff, wine was considered the delicacy because grapes and stuff couldn't really grow there.
Right.
So, like, when it comes to trade and stuff like that, it was almost opposite what was considered a delicacy, which is hilarious when you think about it. Like, I couldn't imagine considering beer a delicacy nowadays. Like, I'm sure that there's definitely some high-class beers out there that are like a premium or something like that, but literally thinking like, oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience because it was brought in from halfway across the world. Like, it just seems crazy to me.
Right.
And just fascinating. Because I believe, segueing into wine a little bit, there was something to do with once, like, grapes and vineyards and stuff were popularized,
Mm-hmm.
it was almost like a civic duty to have some, like, provide some kind of assistance to provide wine. So,
Yeah.
like, there would be people traveling, or not traveling, like, within their cities, just helping vineyards,
Yeah.
growing their own, and, like, donating and making, like, small batches to distribute.
Yeah.
And that's what reminds me, Rome, or
Yeah.
like the Roman Empire was the one that said, like, the wine is for the everyman. It's not like a fancy thing. It's just kings drank
Right.
it, peasants drank it. It doesn't matter.
Well, and here's my question. What do you think like one of the first really popular styles of wine were? Like red wine, white wine?
I'm not a huge wine kind of.
Oh, you're not gonna. This is
I'm
kind of a
probably
trick
not gonna
question.
guess it. If I had to make, like,
We don't have to like narrow in on a varietal because varietals that's more of a new world thing
right,
anyway.
I'm trying to think of even wines that I know.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. I'm trying to think, and you'd think with my job I would know a little bit more about alcohol, but that's a side note. No, I really have no idea what it would be. Maybe just like a standard, just red wine. I don't know.
Blush wines, pink wines, like rosé was kind of the thing that you would see in.
Are those the ones that are sugary?
So that brings
like
up
a
an
sweet
interesting
wine.
point, right? So not all red wine is dry. Not all
Right.
white wine is sweet,
Mm.
right? That has to do with controlling the fermentation process.
Yeah.
And what makes a red wine is when you ferment your grape juice, you ferment with the grape skins. So you get juice to skin contact.
Okay.
That makes for a darker, richer red wine.
Gotcha.
If you separate that juice from the wines early on or before the fermentation process,
Mm-hmm.
you're left with like a rosé or like a pink wine, blush wine. And so that was what a lot of the early Romans, that's what they had.
Right.
Because they weren't fermenting on the skin. That was, I believe, a newer age thing.
I gotcha. That's
Yeah.
interesting. No, because like the classic depictions of wine, it's always red wine.
Right,
Like,
right.
Always like 9 times out of 10 red
Right.
wine.
And I wish I could tell you a little bit more information. I don't know kind of when they kind of transition, when they realize if we leave this on, you're going to make this red wine.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, let's fast forward a little bit and talk about kind of, maybe let's step back and talk a little bit more about just wine in general,
Okay,
right?
yeah. This is the subject I probably know the least about.
Yeah.
All I know is that from what I've tried, and I couldn't tell you like it's Pinot Noir or what, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's technically called, but what I've noticed my favorites are like dry white wines.
Dry whites?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It's just always the ones that I've preferred.
Well, and
how about you?
I think for me, my favorite wine is probably the wine that I'm drinking.
Okay. Yeah. For the longest time, people would be like, "Oh, this is a 2003 blah 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 blah." I'm like, tastes like wine.
Yeah.
And like, I can't tell the difference. And apparently, from a little bit of research I did, what's it called, the wine?
Oh, the sommeliers.
Yeah, as long as they're blindfolded, they don't really know either.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, you want to talk about the world of sommeliers?
We can get to that. Because what did you want to branch out with?
Oh yeah. Let's wrap up. And talk more about American history, because we're kind of like just taking big jumps here, but I know we're kind of don't have a ton of time.
Right.
But yeah, I think that American history and how alcohol kind of shaped America, right? I mean, when we first came over here, distilleries were a big thing, right? Okay. People had beer when they first came over. In fact, when the Pilgrims first came to the New World, they brought more beer than they did water.
That makes sense.
But right, and again, it has to do with because it was safer to drink beer, right? It lasted. But when they came over here, they started producing a lot of gin.
Okay.
So gin was the big thing in the New World for a very, very, very long time, until we started trading with the Bahamas and Trinidad, where we were starting to get sugar.
Okay.
So,
actually, now that I think about it, in all of like the audio books and stuff that I listen to, and like some of the introduction videos and stuff, I don't think I ever saw anything on like where gin was like originated
So gin was probably one of the first big spirits that were available to the public.
from. Okay. Is it because it smells like Christmas trees?
Well, no, but yes, that is a big characteristic of gin, right? So
Right.
gin is made with juniper and other botanicals. That's what kind of makes it. It's a neutral grain spirit
Right.
that is made with juniper and botanicals. That's kind of like the what
Flowery. Yeah.
right. And I don't want to get into an argument with somebody.
Oh, I'll fight you.
But
we're in my house.
but to get into semantics, right? So
Mm-hmm.
vodka is a neutral grain spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Gin is a neutral grain spirit with botanicals.
That's the only difference. Well,
Right, and this is why I don't want to get into.
Yeah.
There's a distillery here in Indiana, Hard Truth, that's down in Nashville, Indiana.
Yeah.
I did the distillery tour there not that long ago, and they said that they use the same grain bill for their gin as they do for their vodka.
That's crazy to me.
Just-
I couldn't.
yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that. 'Cause
Right.
I've had vodka and I don't know if I've ever actually drank gin on its own.
Yeah,
Does
it's.
anybody do that? It doesn't sound like a good time.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe old sailors. I don't know.
It sounds bad. Like a gin and tonic's super good.
Yeah.
With like some lime. But
Right.
I don't know if I've ever just had a shot or whatever of gin.
Yeah.
But I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that there's so little differences between gin and vodka. When
Yeah.
you look at it, it makes sense.
Right.
But taste-wise, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. Because it's just that's what it. And I think that I'm sure it depends on where you go. I don't know a ton about gin, but they typically will tend to like steep the botanicals after it comes off of the still.
Mm-hmm.
So it's you have your gin, add your bag, and then after 2-3 weeks, once everything's infused, then you take that and you bottle the runoff there, right?
Okay.
So yeah, but gin was the big thing. That was one of the big first things people were distilling.
That's cool. I
So-
would have never guessed that either.
So then, right, we start trading with with the Bahamas and in Puerto Rico, and we start getting sugar.
Oh, I remember hearing something about this because
Yeah.
that's when we started making rum.
Rum.
Yeah.
So-
I'm not dumb.
Rum was such a big part in America's founding. Like any major city in the 13 colonies had a rum distillery.
Okay.
It was part of cocktails. Everybody loved it. It was such a big thing.
So rum is generally classified in the same. It's clearly different, but it's normally wrapped in the same categories like whiskeys.
Correct.
bourbons.
Spirit. Right.
What is so revolutionary, or what made rum so revolutionary when I'm sure whiskey and bourbon and all them already existed?
So rum is distilled sugar cane.
Okay.
Specifically, dark rum is made from molasses.
Okay.
So it was a byproduct of making refined sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Molasses, you could turn that into dark rum. So rum's a big deal now, right? Rum is a
Gotcha.
big deal in the colonies. Britain comes along and they say they're turning all this profit. We want a cut of the pie.
For sure.
They start taxing sugar. And
That's the first big mistake right there.
and so that's just one of the things, right? Like you start talking about, and that kind of gives rise to no taxation without representation.
Right. I remember in like history class, because I'm a huge history buff, I definitely remember learning that there was like a stamp tax and a sugar tax,
Right.
and all the different taxes. I guess I never really asked the question of why they taxed sugar,
Right.
and I guess I just assumed that it was British, so it has probably something to do with tea or something stupid. But,
Right.
like rum, that's a much bigger deal than tea.
Yeah. So I don't want to say it was direct. That's the exact reason why we went to war with Great Britain
But
in the
it's a
Revolutionary
big
War.
part.
But it was a big factor.
Right.
Right. So So we finish, we win the Revolutionary War.
Of course.
And when we win the Revolutionary War, Great Britain says, okay, you want your independence? You don't get sugar anymore because they control the sugar trade.
Gotcha.
So they cut off America's access to sugar.
Mm-hmm.
So
what has sobered up a lot of people?
No, well, that's what you'd think. but
we're determined.
But we're America, damn it. So what do we do instead? Make whiskey.
Nice.
So
rum came before whiskey? Or?
Whiskey is kind of one of those things. It's kind of been pretty ubiquitous. It's kind of one of those things. Like, it's been around since 1600s.
But just never really got super popular?
I don't know how popular it was. I'm sure people were still making whiskey.
I got you. It's more of a niche market.
Right, but the thing is at the time, rum is what everybody wanted, right? Yeah. So there was gin, there was whiskey, there was rum. So when people started expanding, right, they started planting more corn. Mm-hmm. And so with that, they would produce whiskey because now they can't get rum as easily. So they start producing whiskey. And so one of the first things that the new American government does is they impose a whiskey tax.
Okay.
So after the Revolutionary War,
right,
we
literally fought a war on taxes.
Exactly.
And then they're just like tax.
Yeah. Well, and you think about it, right? We owed a lot of money. We owed money to France, and we had to figure out a way to pay it back.
Which it's the irony is obviously not lost on anybody.
Right.
But it just sounds dumb.
Right. And you can imagine, right? So Alexander Hamilton, he was the one who first proposed the whiskey tax, right?
And he's the one from the play. Correct?
He's the one from the play. The very same.
Right. Nothing. There was nothing else before that.
So Lin-Manuel Miranda proposes the whiskey tax. So, and the whole rationale was, right, it was kind of one of those things where he considered whiskey to kind of be a luxury, right? So it was kind of one of those, well, if you want it, you got to pay for it.
Yeah, you can get it for like a liter of it for like $8.
All right. depending on how desperate you are.
Right. Well, that wasn't part of the. I was just saying simple price.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So they are able to, they put in this tax, and a lot of farmers are not crazy about it, as you could imagine.
For sure.
And the tax turns out to be wholly unpopular with a lot of farmers because this is how they make their money.
Right.
So there was a big rebellion. I think something like 300, maybe there were more soldiers come out. I'm sorry, not soldiers. They were just like a
local militia.
Yeah, like a local militia.
Right.
They stopped the collectors from trying to collect the money. So George Washington sends a mediator to try and negotiate, while at the same time raising a group of like thousands of soldiers to march on this town. I think there were like 6 deaths in the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Like, they saw the army and they were like, no, we don't want to do this.
Right, but there was obviously that one dude that was like, I'm going to throw a rock.
Right, exactly. So the whiskey tax, it's kind of a bit of a side note, right? But
right.
What
I mean,
it really,
it's important,
very important, right? But kind of what it represents, right, is it shows that this newfound government had the ability to enforce its own laws.
Yeah.
That was a big deal.
Mm-hmm. It was more of a show of like, look, we can do this more so than upholding what necessarily is there.
Right. So I mean, and it's also worth noting, right, at all this time, like, we're still talking about, like, everybody believes alcohol is a gift from God. Right. What's not a gift from God, and is in fact what they attribute to the devil, is drunkenness. So overuse, alcohol abuse.
Right.
So that is damned.
Right.
I think even during all the Whiskey Rebellion, they were referring to the whiskey tax as a sin tax.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's still like any kind of tax on like gambling or cigarettes or whatever is still widely called a sin tax, which is a weird way to put it, but it's kind of cool if you think about it.
So let's go through. We're just gonna kind of gloss over the 19th century a little bit. It's important, right? I mean, whiskey is a big part of American culture.
Now I do have to ask.
Yeah.
Out of what is generally in the whiskey kind of category, like whiskey, bourbon, rum, all those, my favorite has always been bourbon when it comes to taste. I don't honestly know the difference between that and the others. Yeah,
that's a good question. So bourbon is America's liquor. It's probably the shortest way to describe it.
So it's an American thing?
It is an American thing.
Man, I am patriotic and I didn't even know it.
So bourbon, for it to be considered bourbon, it, number one, has to be made in the United States.
Okay.
Awesome. It has to be made with a minimum of 51% corn in the entire grain bill.
Okay. Corn's not what separates it though, right?
So corn's isn't what separates it, but
it's the sheer amount.
But it's the amount, right?
Gotcha.
So there's like corn whiskey, which is just like 100% corn, but
it's just it's a corn on the cob.
Right.
Yeah, you just eat it.
So you could literally, I believe, you can make 100% corn whiskey, and as long as you follow the rest of what makes it bourbon, it's technically can be considered bourbon.
Okay.
I don't know anybody who does that.
Right.
So anyway, at least 51% corn in the grain bill. It has to, when it comes off of the still, it has to come off, I think, it can't be above like 125 proof.
Okay.
And then when it goes in, I'm probably wrong on this one. It might be a little bit higher. When it goes into the barrel, it can't be more than I think 85 proof. And then it has to be aged in...
It loses proof? Because
yes.
You said 125 earlier and then 85.
Right. So, and I think I'm wrong on those numbers. I'll while we're sitting here chatting, I'll kind of remind myself what they are.
Neither one of us are experts. The point of what I'm hoping this show does is encourage people to kind of get more involved with whatever they hear.
Yeah.
So if you're off by whatever, it doesn't particularly matter. It's just interesting to note that it loses.
Yeah. So, and I just looked it up. So it has to, when it comes off the still, it can't be more than 160 proof.
Gotcha. That's higher.
Right. So, and when it goes into the container, it can't be more than 125 proof.
Okay.
And I think when it's actually bottled, it has to be no more than, it's either 85 or 90 proof.
That's interesting. So I'm guessing that happens through the distilling process?
Well, so when it comes off of the still, right, then you add water to get it where you want.
Okay.
Then it goes into the barrel.
Oh, so it's more of a dilution thing. Oh,
right.
Okay.
So you dilute it to where you want it to be.
I got you. That makes a lot of sense.
And then the last thing is it has to be aged in a new charred barrel.
Okay.
But that's what is pretty required to call it bourbon.
That's interesting.
Right.
I would have. Yeah, I didn't know any of that. Yeah. That's really cool though.
And a lot of people think that bourbon is it has to be made in Bourbon County in Kentucky, which is not true.
It just has to be made in America.
Right, it just has to be made in America. It's just that there's some properties that make it really well, and that's kind of where bourbon really took off was in Kentucky. So
I got you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know when I was looking up a lot of stuff, there's tons and tons and tons of information on like beer and wine, but I was struggling to get like really detailed stuff about others just because there's not as much recorded history.
Yeah.
But that's really cool to know.
Yeah.
One thing I did find out that I thought was pretty cool. Do you know why we measure alcohol in barrels?
No.
So this was part of something that I was looking at. I'm sorry. I reversed that. Do you know why we measure oil in barrels?
No, I do not.
that's what I meant to ask. It's because of alcohol.
Huh.
It's because, like, when you shipped alcohol, it was convenient to keep it in barrels.
Yeah.
And barrels generally had a standard unit of measurement.
Mm-hmm.
So when they would ship things, they would literally just take old alcohol barrels, fill them with oil because they were so sealed that they would just ship oil in alcohol barrels.
Oh, wow.
So, like, the whole reason that we measure oil in barrels is because of the alcohol industry. And I thought that was just a random side fact that I got that was really cool.
Well, and you want to talk about barrels. I mean, yeah, I don't know if you've ever heard of cooperages or coopering.
Nope.
So coopers are the people that actually make barrels.
Okay.
So, like I mentioned, for bourbon and wine, a lot of the time you'll see them aged in wooden barrels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, these barrels have to be charred, they have to be watertight, and they have to last for years.
Right. So, quick side note, just more out of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
why do they need to be charred? Is it a flavor thing? Is it a, like, well, I don't personally see the purpose in it being charred.
Yeah. So it's part of a flavor thing. I don't really know all the reasons why. I mean, like, char kind of gives it like a woody, charred flavor when you like think about bourbon, right?
I got you. Yeah.
But I don't know exactly all the benefits of charring.
Mm-hmm.
And charring, I mean, that's a whole science in itself that is daunting.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, cooperages it's such an amazing process because almost all of these barrels are made from hand.
Wow, that's like, are you talking about today?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh man, I figured they'd get some machine to put that shit together in a heartbeat.
No, these are most like it's just these like families that have been doing it forever, and it's incredible to watch.
That's fascinating. I know. Haven't you done the what's it called, the something trail for whiskey and bourbon?
I've done a couple of the distilleries on the bourbon trail.
So did you see any of that in person?
Well, so the thing is that not a lot of distilleries, I don't think there are any in the United States that actually make their own.
Oh,
Usually they buy them from another place, right?
Gotcha.
I'm sure there are some that have their own cooperages, but it is, I mean, it's its own art form, right?
Okay. That's pretty cool though.
Yeah.
I mean, after this, I'm going to try and look up a couple of videos. It baffles me that they would even try and put it together by hand.
It's crazy. I mean, and it is a lot of work. I mean, so when I was still in grad school, I think I told you I took a semester off, went and worked at a winery, and one of the things that they did at this winery is they did some small batch barrel fermented wines.
Okay.
And
fermented wines.
Barrel fermented. So what they did was they would buy their barrels, right? Mm-hmm. They would take off one face of the barrel. Okay. They would put all the skins and the juice, and they would ferment in there.
I got you. So just by being in that, it took on some kind of flavor.
Right. It pulls more tannins out of the woods. Yeah. It's more wood exposure than it would get just from putting it in the barrel. Cool. But watching, I mean, these things are so tightly constructed, right? And it's just incredible to see how much, because I think it's like, I think that there's typically 6 rings on the barrel that hold the whole thing. So 3 on each side that hold the barrel together. All right. And that keeps these barrels watertight.
Gotcha.
And so to take off the top, you literally have to take off 3 of these rings. And these are like metal rings that are just like, I mean, they're like, it's like a belt. You pull super, super tight.
Okay. Man, the fact that like a lot of this stuff is still handmade and stuff just shows how much passion goes into it.
Right.
Because do you know how easy it would be just from like a financial standpoint?
Yeah.
How much easier it would be just to throw it together with a machine or some kind of assistance like that.
Yeah.
Like, it shows it's really cool. Like, you don't
Right.
see a lot of that anywhere.
Right. And I'm sure, to some degree, any one of these industries, right, there's some automation because
sure.
you have to keep up. I mean, there's only so many cooperages in the world, and they have to service, every winery, every distillery. I mean, there's some new age stuff where people might like age in like a stainless steel and then throw wood chips, but then, you're not necessarily talking about bourbon. I've heard some people say that they like age it in stainless and then they'll add, oak to it. I don't know if you're really talking about classifying it as bourbon at that point,
Right.
but that's a conversation that you can get in with the courts.
Right.
So
Something that more than me and you are particularly going to argue over.
Right.
Like if it tastes like bourbon and it looks like bourbon,
Right.
to me, I would probably consider it
Right.
bourbon. Where there's somebody that's like a purist that's like, no.
right, and that's why I mean you'll see some stuff that are like labeled like bourbon style or.
I had a beer one time that was apparently aged in a bourbon barrel.
Oh yeah.
And like to this day, it's one of my favorites, and I haven't been able to find it.
Well, and that's the other thing, right? So like I mentioned, for it to be bourbon, it has to be aged in new charred oak barrels.
Right.
So what happens with all of those barrels once they're done, right?
Okay.
So, but actually, it's really interesting. Is a lot of breweries will buy them because then they can do barrel-aged beers in them.
Right.
And a lot of distilleries in Scotland will buy them. Scotland, Ireland will buy them and age their whiskeys, their Scotch, Irish whiskeys, in those barrels.
Oh, we haven't even brought up Scotch.
Oh yeah, we're not even there.
Right. No, but that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So they can't reuse it for bourbon again?
Can't reuse it for bourbon.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that just another one of those like tradition things, or like what's stopping them?
I don't know. The law.
Okay, that's a good reason for me.
Yeah.
But no, that's crazy. So what exactly? I guess what exactly is Scotch then?
So Scotch has to come from.
Probably my least favorite in this category.
Well, and here's the thing I'll say about Scotch is I think that if you don't like Scotch, then you haven't had the right kind. And obviously everybody's palate is unique.
Oh yeah.
I'm not gonna sit here and be like, oh well, you haven't tried this one.
For sure. I mean, different strokes for different
Right.
folks, right? Like,
Right.
I'm not saying that if you like Scotch, you're like a lesser person or whatever. It's just, for me, it's never been my thing. I don't know what it is about it that's so
Right.
different, but I've never been able. I think it's because I don't really do mixers,
Yeah.
and like, I just like bourbon so much. To me,
Right.
Scotch just tastes like weird bourbon.
Right. So I don't know a lot of what necessarily constitutes Scotch. So Scotch, though, has to be made in Scotland.
Okay.
There's Scotch style, again, Scotch style,
For sure.
but it has to be made in Britain. I'm not sorry, Britain. In Scotland. It has to be made on a pot still.
Okay.
Where typically a lot of bourbon nowadays is made with column stills. Most Scotch and Irish whiskeys as well are made on pot stills.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily need to be a single malt. There are blended Scotch whiskeys or like multiple malt, I believe. But yeah, like a lot, like you'll see like a single malt typically means that it was one single malt.
Okay. I don't even really know what you mean by a single malt.
So yeah, malt is essentially your grain that you're using. So malt refers to malted barley, right? So
which is a common ingredient in a lot of beer.
Exactly.
Well.
Yeah. So it's a common ingredient in beer, a lot of whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, what happens is you take all of your grains, right? All of your barley or whatever. You'll germinate it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just trying to get the sprout to break out of that grain kernel.
Okay.
And then you kill the germination process by heating it, by kilning it.
Okay.
And when it breaks through that husk or that grain husk, it typically makes it sweeter.
Okay.
So you get a lot more of that fermentable sugar.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So Scotch generally is sweeter then because of that?
Right. So no, it can be. I mean, all of these are sweet in their own way, right?
Yeah.
So I think this might be a good segue to start talking about the fermentation process,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So when you talk about fermenting beer, wine, and distillates, right? Fermentation is essentially the process of yeast converting sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So for beer, right, you'll have a grain bill. For liquor, you'll have a grain bill, or whiskey, you'll have a grain bill. You will add in typically it's a cultured strain of yeast. A lot of time when you're dealing with distillates, you'll use a yeast that produces a sour flavor. Okay. That's why if you've ever looked at a bottle, it'll say sour mash on it.
Oh, okay.
It's because the actual yeast produces a byproduct that is sour.
Gotcha. I know this may be a stupid question or like a no-duh moment, but I'm guessing that's why recently there's been like a popularity in like sour beers as well, right?
I don't know.
Is it a similar process?
So I don't know if it's the reason why. Sour beer is something that has existed for a very long time.
I didn't really hear about it until a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I think that has to do a lot with kind of the trends.
Right.
When we talk about craft beer, right? The market is very. It changes depending on what's selling now, right? I mean, I think the real craft beer scene probably started in the 80s, right? Okay. And probably the first really, really big thing that came out of that, right, were pale ales, IPAs, right?
I'm a big fan of IPAs.
Right, and IPAs really took off in like the 2000s, right? Like you couldn't go to a brewery or like a craft brewery that didn't have like at least 3 on tap.
Oh, right.
And then you started seeing this transition more towards like saisons and farmhouse ales, and then kind of like to sour beers. Really, what kind of separates sour beers from, like your lagers and ales, is it's a different yeast strain. Mm-hmm. It essentially it leaves a byproduct that is either that is either sour or acidic.
I gotcha.
Yeah. So like vinegar, right? But yeah, so some yeast will produce either a flavor that is more clean. Some will produce one that is sweeter. Some will produce one that are sour. So it's all in your yeast selection, style of beer or liquor you're trying to make. So anyway, so you have your grain bill, right? So let's say you're gonna make a pilsner, German pilsner. Mm-hmm. Typically, pilsners are a lot of like light malts, something that ferments very clean. If you're doing something like an ale or something, or like a amber, you might have something that's like something that is going to ferment really clean, and then you add like an amber grain, right,
amber
to give it that color.
Generally are my favorite.
Yeah.
So it's cool to know.
So you after you've taken that, we're going to bypass the kilning product. You have your malted grain. Mm-hmm. You add that to a big pot of water. Right, and the percentage of that changes. Usually, it's like a little bit more water by volume than grain by pound. Mm-hmm. So you add a little bit more water, and essentially you're making like oatmeal.
Okay,
it's probably the best way of liking it. So that water is heated, and so inside the grain there are these enzymes that react at certain temperatures. And they will break down the starches in the grain to fermentable sugars, or they'll create sugars that aren't necessarily fermentable, but they create like a sweeter flavor.
I gotcha.
Right. So Depending on the beer you're making, you'll change your temperature accordingly, but essentially you're pulling out all of the sugars that you want to convert from sugar to alcohol.
Gotcha.
So after that process is called, oh shoot, I should know this. I've done this so many times. I know.
This is embarrassing.
I know. I haven't made beer in a while. Somebody's going to be like, you idiot.
Yeah, all right. There's always that guy, though.
This is called the mash process. Yeah, it's the mash process. And so you pull out the sugar, and then you have to collect that sweet like water, right?
Right.
That process is called sparging, and that's where you add water on top that is at a slightly higher temperature than whatever you were mashing at, because it helps get the sugars out.
Oh, okay.
So it makes them a little bit more water soluble, so they go through.
That's interesting.
So that, like I said, that process is called sparging, and when you sparge, you collect that runoff. The runoff, that sweet water, is called wort.
Okay. These are all very attractive names.
I know, right?
Like splarting?
Yeah.
Splarting and worts.
Wort.
Man.
Yeah.
So appealing.
So then you have your wort.
Right. Normally they've got medication for that. You can freeze them off.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And
so,
they go in beer and whiskey and stuff. It's crazy.
So then for beer, what you'll do is you'll boil it, right? And then you'll add your hops during the boil. And depending on when you add your hops, you get different characteristics of those hops, right?
Okay.
So the earlier on in your boil you add hops, you get more bitterness.
Okay.
The later you add, you get more of the aroma to it.
Gotcha. So by that assumption, IPAs would be much later in the process with a lot more?
So typically IPAs, you might have one that's going to give you a really, really bitter flavor up front, and then maybe 30 minutes into the boil, you'll add more. Maybe You're going to get like a little bit more bitterness, but more aroma, and then you're going to save your like really aromatic hops for the end, right?
Okay.
So after that process, after you add your hops, then you cool it, and then you add your yeast.
Okay.
Then you ferment, and then once you're done fermenting, you would carbonate, bottle, whatever. For liquor, right? You will you'll take your grain, you'll do that same kind of mash. Then you'll add all of your you'll add your yeast, and like I said, a lot of times when we're talking about like whiskey, right, we get what's called a sour mash.
Okay.
And so if you actually taste it, it tastes really sour. It doesn't taste very good. So typically when you do your mash, right, for liquor, you probably end up with something that's like between like 7 and 12% alcohol.
Okay.
And now that's called, I believe it's called like distiller's beer. So then what you do with that, like you're not going to get any more alcohol by adding more yeast, right?
Okay.
So then what you do is you take that distiller's beer or brewer's beer or whatever they call it, and you will pump that into a still.
Mm-hmm. So
distilling is something, like I said, that people have been doing for, forever since like the Byzantine Empire when they were trying to find the Philosopher's Stone,
nice.
Right?
I know when I was looking into it, and correct me if I'm wrong, which most likely I could be, distilling has something to do with you bring it to a certain temperature and it boils it and it brings the alcohol over to where you can add more alcohol, which is how you get the higher percentages.
So typically what happens, right? So when you do your distilling, right, there's you're kind of playing with the boiling temperature of different compounds, right?
Okay.
So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, right? So that, and when I say it boils, right, that's the point where it's evaporating into gaseous form. Mm-hmm. Alcohol, ethanol, evaporates at something like 72 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So what you do is you take all of your mash, right, all of your brewer's beer or whatever, you heat that to a temperature where your alcohol starts to evaporate. And what happens is it kind of comes off in like this little cone. What you do is you hyper cool that. So you run cold water along that. And what that does is that causes your alcohol to recondense into water or into a liquid. And then you collect that runoff.
Gotcha.
So that runoff is what's known as white dog. It is a clear...
Interesting name.
It's a very interesting name. It is a clear liquid. And a lot of times when you talk to distillers, they refer to what's called the heads, the tails, and the heart. Typically, when you distill, you want to target that heart because there's methyl alcohols and there's other other like additives or stuff that you don't want on the heads and the tails. Sometimes they might pull that back and put it back into like the next set of brewer's mash.
Okay.
But you want to collect that heart.
Gotcha.
So when you collect that heart, right, like I said, it's going to be a clear liquid. Doesn't matter if it's whiskey, vodka, gin, whatever you're making. It's usually very clear because that is like the distilled form. So that, like, that brown bourbon that you're drinking, that comes entirely from the barrel.
Oh, the color?
The color.
Oh,
all of it comes from the barrel. Yep.
Yeah, I guess I just kind of assumed that since most of them use like corn and wheat and stuff
right.
like that would be where the color comes from, more
right.
so than just the barrel.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that either. There's a lot of stuff in this episode that I wouldn't have guessed, mostly just because I don't have a lot of time to think about it when I'm just chugging it.
Right. Well, that's the thing, right? And that's why like,
it's really fascinating. Like,
I feel like we're coming full circle now. It's like
yeah,
this is why I think it's so cool because
right.
it's so much science and engineering and art and history.
Just to get shit-faced and black out in it.
There you go.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful.
America.
Yeah. Well, actually, to wrap things up with like a final thing, do you want to cover a little bit more about like the American history side of things? Because like one thing that we didn't touch on is the fact that our country decided to try and make it illegal.
Oh, yeah.
Every single person was like, absolutely not.
Yeah, well, and that kind of, I was reading an interesting article where it was, somebody brought up, it's like, you only see change from the people that require the change. It's the people that, like, are never affected or never up in the news that ever, like, they're not noteworthy.
Right.
They don't care about that.
Yeah.
It's the guy who's jumping on the table with his pants down at 3 o'clock in the morning.
You didn't have to call me out. That's not fair. Man, I didn't say anything personal about you.
But that's the thing, right? So there's a lot of hearsay, conjecture, but like I said, alcohol use has always been considered it used to be considered like a blessing from God.
Yeah.
Alcohol misuse was always considered sin, and you talk about kind of like where we were as a country at the time. There's one of the rumors, I don't want to say it's a rumor because I know there's some truth to it, but
allegedly.
well, you talk about, right, so when we outlawed the sale and prohibition of alcohol, that was the 18th Amendment, right?
Right. And
we didn't reinstate it until the 21st Amendment.
Right. Now we have liquor stores named after it.
There you go.
Yeah.
But what happened in between, right?
19 and 20.
Right. So what was it? But the 19th Amendment, right, was women's suffrage.
Right.
So one story that I heard, and again, I don't know how much of an impact this really had. I'm sure there's some truth to it. Is that the suffrage movement had a lot to do with that, right?
That's cool.
That's one thing. I don't know how true that is.
That alone sounds like something that you could have an entire discussion about.
Oh, absolutely.
That sounds awesome.
Absolutely. But again, it was a small amount of people. It was a small amount of preachers and politicians that said this is morally wrong. Yeah. This shouldn't be what America stands for. And I don't really know all the history about how we got there, but
but that's enough to where like it sparks interest.
Yeah.
Because like I'm going to have to deep dive into that. 'Cause
Yeah.
I can't just leave it that surface level stuff.
Right.
I mean, hell, we could both do some research and have another episode.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, that sounds really cool.
But what's really interesting is kind of like all of the so how Prohibition impacted America's liquor industry and how it survived.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's really interesting because after Prohibition, like, or during Prohibition, it all but like killed a lot of the bourbon industry.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that not all distilleries died because you could get a prescription from a doctor for bourbon for medicinal purposes during Prohibition.
All right, I need a new doctor. Because that sounds awesome.
And the other thing is a lot of wineries survived, right? A lot of wineries survived all of this because they were exempt from religious and medical reasons.
Okay.
So because wine was so big in communion,
Yeah.
right? So Catholic faith, some wineries survived that too. And one of my favorite stories that came out of this is there was one winery that I heard about. They used to sell it was like a block of Kool-Aid.
All right.
So they would take the grapes,
Mm-hmm.
they'd juice them, and then they would dehydrate the juice,
All right.
and then they would sell you the block, and they would say, "Here's how you make grape juice. Just take this and dissolve it in water, but don't leave it outside."
That's a genius idea.
And so it was like, if you leave it outside, you're gonna get wine, and you don't want to get wine.
That's illegal. I would never do that.
So
That's
there's
such a good idea, though.
there's
Just
yeah.
the thought process of people, they were like, we could just
Yeah.
do this.
And then you get into, moonshiners and bootleggers and speakeasies, and that's a whole thing in itself.
Oh yeah, I'm fascinated by, like you said, the 18th Amendment.
Yeah.
Was the one that got rid of it, and then literally 3 later,
Yeah.
they were like, all right, we messed up. Like,
Mhm.
there's not enough people listening to this, and like, isn't it JFK? Like his family, didn't they have something to do?
His family were associated with mobsters that were bootleggers during Prohibition.
Right, and then he became president.
Mhm.
But like the guy that did it directly didn't. But like what was
Right.
it, son, grandson? I think it was son.
I think it was his grandson.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, Prohibition was like 1920 to like, I think like the 30s.
Yeah.
So
I do know in one of the documentaries that I was watching, they did a brief thing, and I almost wanted to deep dive into this dude because he sounded like a baller for the time. They called him like Honest McCoy or McVoy or something like that.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything about that?
Mm-mm.
I wish I could remember his exact name, but he was the single largest distributor of alcohol during Prohibition. Where like he would literally just have boats just docked offshore of rum and stuff like that, and like he built a reputation by like not watering down his alcohol. So like that's why everybody went with him.
Well, and I guess I know we're kind of coming up to it.
Oh, we're good.
But yeah, there's some other really interesting stuff that
I mean,
after.
it feels like we've just scratched the surface. On a lot of stuff. Like,
Well, and you talk about, right, I mentioned that Prohibition was really hard for the liquor industry, but what came after the Prohibition totally changed the landscape of whiskey and bourbon in America. Because during Prohibition, before Prohibition, there was very little regulation on a lot of this stuff.
oh, is this when they started messing with what was in it and like people were dying and going blind? And all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Like living with just the fear of something that I enjoy as a hobby just outright killing me.
Yeah. So a lot of that, brought about a lot of change to how the liquor industry was regulated.
Yeah.
And it brought a lot of standards and kind of, it's just incredible. I mean, you could talk so much about just the liquor industry at the turn of the 20th century.
Well, I think something's funny. I'm trying to remember. I don't know the timeline for this. I do know that it started after what we're talking about, but like alcohol and stuff wasn't covered by, what is it, the FDA? And I don't know if they are now. I think they are now. But like that's the main reason that most alcohol bottles don't have like nutritional labels on them unless they meet like very weird specific parameters.
Well, I think I'm pretty sure that they're under ATF.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, right?
Right. Yeah.
So they'd be regulated by the ATF, but
there's some weird parameters though that can make your alcohol fall under the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
I think for some odd reason, when it comes to beer, it has to have over or under a certain percentage of like barley.
Yeah.
And then like any wine that's under 7% for some reason is considered under the FDA. Like there's a bunch of oddball.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like random things about it.
Well, and then you start talking about like how a lot of this stuff is taxed too.
Right.
I mean, the tax laws for alcohol are insane.
Oh yeah, anything that's labeled under that sin tax is outrageous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a weird, more of a niche thing, but think about gambling rings and stuff like that. Like, good lord. Like, there's so much.
Well, I think there was, God, I can't remember, what do they call them? They have like, I can't remember the names of them, but they're not so much a thing that they use now, but a lot of older distilleries, they have these things where like, it's literally, they used to get taxed on how high the proof was when it came off the still.
Okay.
So they had, it wasn't called a tax box, but it was a box that was literally like a fountain of their White Dog, right?
Okay.
And so when the tax collector came to the distilleries, he had the only key to get into these boxes, and he could test the alcohol for that, so he could tell them how much they had to pay in taxes.
Wouldn't that overvalue it? Because that would have a higher concentration.
It would absolutely overvalue
so they're
it.
making more money by doing some shady shit.
Yeah, I don't think they use these so much these days. A lot of distilleries still have them kind of more as like a historical thing. Yeah.
That's pretty cool though.
But they still, I mean, it still gets taxed, right? And there's always a reason why, like, you go to the liquor store, right? And a 6-pack of beer costs less than a bottle of wine, which costs less than a bottle of bourbon or tequila or whatever. And it's just all because of how much we spend, or how much work goes into that, and how much you're willing to pay for it, and really good marketing.
Yeah, that's crazy. And there's so many different like nooks and crannies when it comes to alcohol.
Yeah.
Like, we made a joke earlier about the people that are like really good at judging wine and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, there's literally people that's livelihood is that.
Oh yeah, man. Like
we're basically, in the amount of time that we're talking, trying to fit like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. Like, it's physically impossible to get more than just surface level stuff with what we've been talking about. But it would be super interesting to get like a really deep dive of an industry. Yeah,
there's a great documentary. I think it's on Netflix still, or Hulu, or one of those.
Right.
It's called SOMM, SOMM, and it came out probably like 15 years ago now, and it was all about following like these 4 or 5 guys who were taking their grandmaster level test for the sommelier exam.
Okay.
And it is crazy the amount of work that these guys do, because there's 4 levels when it comes to sommelier. There's the introductory level, the sommelier level, advanced, and then master level.
Right. Which there's hardly any masters, right?
There's in the world. You can go online and actually look up and see how many there are, but I think in the world right now there are less than 200.
I got you.
It's one of the lowest passed tests in the world. And it takes place, it takes place over a couple of days. There's a knowledge portion, there's a serving portion, and then there's a blind taste test portion.
Right.
So the knowledge portion, and they can cover anything when it comes to wine. New world wine, old world wine, wine practices, serving wine. I mean, anything is on the table, right? And then the blind test, they give you 6 glasses, 3 whites, 3 reds, and you have to do your best to identify the vintage, the varietal, the region. Like, it's crazy, right?
It gets down to such nitty gritty details.
Yeah.
I don't even think I would even imagine asking.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to take a sip of a wine and then my brain goes like, a dog licked this on the right side of the river in France before it was transported to Italy, and then a homeless guy sat on it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And watching these guys, man, it's crazy to see, because they, like, in their mind, like, you can just see, like, the cogs, like, just rolling.
Yeah.
Right.
And you said what? SOMM? SOMM?
SOMM. Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to check that out because that sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, but, like, you can just see, like, in their mind, they just have this flow chart, right? They're like, does it have these characters? No, then it's got to be going over here. Does it have this? No, it's got to be this, and they just kind of, like, go down. But it's crazy, man.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine putting that much time into that niche of a thing.
Yeah.
Like, I shouldn't have said that because I've went down a rabbit hole on a lot of stupid shit.
I know.
Like,
but I mean, these guys, this is their life. I mean, these guys are the kind of people that, like, they work in restaurants and they manage wine cellars.
We've got a guy at the company that I work at that I don't know what his rank is. It might be 3rd.
Yeah.
I know for some odd reason, I know this will be the episode that he listens to. And he's like, how dare he insult me with what he said? But he's like really into it, and just hearing him talk about it when I go, like talk to him about anything is so cool. And like the stuff that he does when it comes like the traveling he does for it, it's so cool.
Yeah,
it's awesome. But is there anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I could talk about some wine a little bit. We got like I don't know. I could talk about wine for a few more minutes.
Okay, cool. I'm assuming that at some point we can have a second episode about this.
Yeah.
Because this is really cool. I also have a really cool idea that I'll tell you off mic. Because if I say it, I don't want to set an expectation because it's a little up there. But I think we could have an amazing idea for a second episode.
Cool. Well, maybe then maybe we save wine for another one, because that's a whole.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you talk about wine. I mean, you could talk about New World wine, Old World wine. You could talk about like the judging of Paris in the 70s, and like what goes into making wine and how wine is different from beer, and yeah.
Sure.
We'll save that one for another go.
All right, cool. You want to wrap it up then?
Yeah.
Cool.
Drink responsibly.
Right, yeah. It's also worth noting that neither one of us are experts, so if there's a little bit of information off here or there, we're just a couple guys talking, having a good time.
Yeah, we just like booze.
Yeah, exactly. And feel free to look up more on the subject. I mean, this stuff is really cool. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Feel free to leave in the comments any subjects that you want covered or anything like that. I'll keep everybody posted on what's coming in the future. I'm not sure when we can schedule a second episode on this specifically, but I'm sure you'll be back at some point.
Yeah.
So thanks for dropping by. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun.
Anything you want to leave off with, or are you good to go?
No, I think I'm good, man.
All right, cool.
Enjoy your booze responsibly, and yeah.
Right on. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I will see you next week.